Hey everybody, welcome to our lecture on personality disorders. Personality disorders can be a hard concept for students to understand. How can my personality be disordered? Or it can be a situation where students routinely see themselves in these disorders. And that makes sense. A personality is basically when just one area of a human's personality gets either exaggerated or stagnated to the point where it causes distress, and that this is a stable condition that is seen over the lifespan, and it tends to be a pattern that is inflexible and pervasive. So make sure you're not falling into the medical student model here as we look at some of these in more depth. Personality disorders can be clustered into three different areas: A, B, and C. A is the odd or eccentric area, and in there we see paranoid personality disorder, schizoid, and schizotypal. B is the dramatic or erratic cluster, and in there we see antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic. And C is our anxious or fearful cluster, where we see avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Depending on which version of the textbook you're using, you might have a blurb in there about a new way of assessing personality disorders. That was not actually included in the DSM-5. It is only in the emerging areas or areas for further study. It was not actually changed in the main part of the book. So if you've chosen to use a slightly older edition, there might be a lot more talk about this new model. And like I said, that just didn't come to fruition. So instead, we really focus on these three clusters. So Cluster A. Cluster A takes into account paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, and schizotypal. I find that students have the hardest time telling schizoid and schizotypal apart. And that makes sense. They both sound very similar, so it's hard to build some of those mnemonic devices that we might use as students to remember them. The way I remember it is that schizotypal acts atypically. Their interests are odd or eccentric, whereas schizoid is cold. Like, you have to work on that one a little bit more, but schizoid is cold. They are not interested in social relationships, so it's not like an extreme form of social anxiety. People with social anxiety do want social relationships. People with schizoid do not. And the top one is paranoid, and paranoid personality disorder is when the only symptom is a pervasive paranoia across all situations. Cluster B takes into account antisocial personality disorder, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic. This is a great example of how we use these words in the lay community in a way that's very, very different than how psychology uses these words. For example, people who are narcissistic are sometimes thought to just be a little full of themselves, maybe attention seekers, or maybe just a little selfish. That's not what narcissism means. Narcissism is that to a great extreme, where I think I'm great and fabulous. I don't have empathy for other people because they don't really need empathy because they're not as good as me. I might be a user and might use people to get my own needs met. Same thing's true with antisocial. When I say to friends, hey, I'm feeling a little antisocial today, it might mean that I just don't feel like going out and I'd rather binge this new TV show on the couch and eat a bucket of ice cream. But antisocial in this context means someone who transgresses against society, antisocial. I find that borderline tends to be the one that people talk about the most. And they sometimes talk about it in a way that's a little problematic. People with borderline personality disorders are thought to be just really extremely needy, and that's not the case either. That would be dependent personality disorder, which is in the next area. Borderline personality disorder is more of an instability that that person feels a global sense of instability and reacts to the world because of that instability. And we do find a great overlap of trauma in borderline personality disorder. Cluster C has our avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So notice there's several boxes on this PowerPoint, and I would encourage you to pay attention to those. Avoidant. How do we tell avoidant from social anxiety? Well, remember, social anxiety is just about having that fear of being scrutinized when I'm in public, whereas Avoidant personality disorder is I feel so insecure and inadequate and uncomfortable around people that I pull away from them. Now, it's not schizoid because that person still wants social relationships. They just don't know how to make them work. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder is vastly different than obsessive compulsive disorder. OCPD is more of a obsession with perfectionism. So go back to those slides about perfectionism to know more about that. Remember, OCD was more about a cycle of unwanted, intrusive thoughts, obsessions that create anxiety, and that anxiety can only be calmed by me performing behaviors called compulsions. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder is much more about me being rigid and inflexible and holding other people to rigid standards of perfectionism, as well as sometimes myself. So they're very different. So this class isn't a theories of personality class. So if you're interested in more about personality as a construct or the personality disorders, I encourage you to take that class. As you've seen, several of the personality disorders have a great impact on interpersonal relationships. And a lot of this impact has to do with things like intimacy and empathy. So it's important you understand both of those concepts. I find that empathy is a particularly important concept to understand when we look at the personality disorders. Empathy requires what we call perspective taking, and that's actually a cognitive task. Many of you may have talked about this and the development of empathy in your lifespan class because it is a development. The cognitive ability to take the perspective of another and imagine how you would feel in another person's situation is a cognitive task. And so very small children are not very good at it, and we get better at it as our brains develop. For those of you who are a little more biochemical, the empathy hormone is called oxytocin. Oxytocin is our bonding chemical. It's the one that has us have relationships with others. It's in orgasm, it's in breastfeeding, it's in generosity. It's a really important hormone. I've included a TED Talk in your module so that you can learn more about this hormone. The neat part is that we see two things. One, stress inhibits oxytocin, and you know that. You're a less empathetic, less caring person when you're highly stressed. But it turns out it's not just a psychological thing, it's a biological thing as well. Two, we do find that people who are aggressive towards others or who have antisocial tendencies tend to have problems with their oxytocin receptors. So we're going to take a moment, we're going to talk briefly about oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. And we're doing this in the same module as personality disorders because these two childhood disorders have a direct link to antisocial personality disorder. Now, when I say direct link, I want to be clear. This is about an at-risk developmental pathway. It's not a guarantee. As you move up this pathway, what you'll see is that each concept puts you at risk for the next one. But not everyone who has, let's say, a difficult temperament goes on to develop ADHD because it's more complex than that, as you've learned. There are resiliency factors, there are other at-risk factors, and there's prevention and intervention, which can occur at any of these levels. But let's take a look. What we find is that children who are born with a difficult temperament, and if you go back to lifespan, you'll understand the temperaments again, but children who are born with a difficult temperament are at risk for developing hyperactivity, particularly ADHD. Some children who have ADHD, and as you see, depending on the study, somewhere between 20 or 60% of children with ADHD may develop oppositionality. And a lot of this is because we ignore that ADHD is actually a type of neuroatypicalness. People with ADHD perceive environmental stimulus slightly different. The idea of ADHD is that all of the sensory data that you take in, it's more difficult to privilege out one piece versus another. From oppositionality, we sometimes see children with oppositionality going on to develop conduct problems and delinquency. And children who have conduct problems and delinquency in their childhood are much more likely to develop antisocial personality disorder in their adulthood or antisocial behaviors in their adulthood. But again, Intervention, prevention, and resiliency makes it so that this is not a guaranteed line, it's just a developmental possibility. There are a couple more slides on this PowerPoint for you to go through that talk a little bit more about conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder and expand on what's in the textbook. After that, usually in this course, what I spend time talking about is serial killers because this is an undergraduate abnormal class. None of you are being trained to be diagnosticians. None of you are being trained to actually intervene. And so I can take the time to talk about something that I think is really fun and interesting, and something that some of your classmates find interesting, and something that crops up in our pop culture media a lot, and that's serial killers. However, recently, we've had a lot of spree killers. Spree killers are different than serial killers, or at least we think so, psychologically speaking, but a lot of people confuse them. And in fact, as I'm recording this video, just yesterday, there was another spree killing at a Waffle House in Alabama. And here's the deal. I don't know you. I don't know any of my students that well. I'm not involved in your lives in an intimate level. I don't know who your friends are. I don't know who your family members are. So I don't know that there isn't someone out there who's been touched by one of our recent spree killing tragedies, who isn't somehow involved or having a really hard time, or maybe even not this semester, but last semester or the semester before that. And I don't want you to think that I'm glorifying killers by talking about serial killers. I think you can learn a lot about how the human mind operates and how many things can go wrong in a person's life and biology that would cause them to become what many of us consider to be, as Dr. Michael Stone says, the most evil. But that's very hard to discuss in a video lecture. So instead, I've made the slides on serial killers to be optional for this module, with one small exception, and that's the slides that's on Munchausen's by proxy. The point of this slide originally was to talk about how many people think that all people who are serial killers are male and that there are no female serial killers, and my point was to disprove that. Munchausen is the old name. You may have now heard of this in the current version of the DSM and also in your textbook as factitious disorder. We haven't had a chance to talk about factitious disorder, and that's why I want to talk about it now. There's a difference between malingering and factitious disorder. Malingering is when you pretend to be sick, psychologically or physically, because you're trying to gain some kind of external reward, like disability services or money or something like that. Fictitious disorder is when you pretend to be sick, psychologically or physically, for no external gain. The only gains can only be internal, like feeling like you're getting some attention or sympathy from being sick, but it can't be for any external gain. Factitious disorder can also occur by proxy, and by proxy means another. So you make another person sick, psychologically or physically or both, not because you're trying to get any kind of external reward, but because you enjoy playing caregiver or getting sympathy for taking care of someone who's sick. There have been some pop culture examples of Munchausen's by proxy, such as The Sixth Sense, but there's also been plenty of real-life examples. You have an article on Munchausen's by proxy in the module that's on one of these recent cases that got a lot of attention through BuzzFeed and other kind of viral media sources. The two keys you need to know is the difference between factitious disorder, or Munchausen's, and malingering, and that's the role of external gains. The other key that it's really important for you to know is that Munchausen's by proxy is not a joke. Many people who are the victims of a Munchausen's by proxy case don't survive. And if you'll notice, the mortality rate down there is sometimes 6 to 10%. But it's hard to get a good number on these because sometimes the person makes their by proxy so sick that they actually are sick, and so the autopsy shows that they were sick and not a form of abuse. So I would say that number is quite low, in fact. The only other thing I want to point out in this PowerPoint, since we've made most of the slides on serial killers optional, is the role of the amygdala. We've been tracing the amygdala the whole semester, and I want you to pay attention to how the amygdala is still implicated in these disorders, but in a very different way. Maybe in future incarnations of this online class will spend more time talking about the intersection of abnormal psychology and violence. But right now, I just don't feel like that's an appropriate way to use our time. So I hope you all stay safe. I'll see you on the internet.